The day I signed the papers, the lake was perfectly still. No boats, no voices, just morning light sliding across the water like nothing in the world could ever disturb it. I remember thinking I'd finally found peace. Quiet place. Somewhere I could breathe. What I didn't know was that buying the lake next door would turn my life into a neighborhood war I never asked for. Her house sat just beyond the trees, the kind of place that looked untouchable. Perfect lawn, white railings, and a woman who acted like the land, the water, and everyone around it already belonged to her. I'd seen her before, watching from a distance, always smiling, but never with her eyes. The kind of smile that says rules matter more than people. Around here, folks whispered her name like a warning. HOA president, property enforcer, the neighbor you didn't cross. First, everything seemed fine. I kept to myself. Early mornings by the lake, coffee on the dock, quiet evenings where the water reflected the sky so clearly it felt unreal. Then she found out the lake wasn't shared anymore. It wasn't community access. It was mine. And the moment that truth settled in, something inside her snapped. The polite waves stopped. The smiles disappeared. Suddenly, there were complaints, emails, accusations about property lines, easements, and rules I'd never heard of. She stood at the edge of her yard one afternoon, staring at me like I'd stolen something precious from her. Not just land, but control. I tried to talk, to explain, to keep things civil. But every conversation felt like a test I was meant to fail. She wanted the lake back, or at least the power she thought came with it. And when it became clear I wasn't giving either, she made a promise that chilled me more than any threat ever could. That's when I made a decision I never thought I'd make. A legal one, permanent one. I ordered a 6-foot fence, straight through the middle of her perfect yard. And as the first posts went into the ground, I saw the look on her face, and realized this was no longer about land. It was about what she was willing to do next. The fence didn't go up overnight. It started with bright orange stakes and thin strings stretched tight across the grass, marking lines that had apparently existed long before either of us moved in. To me, they were just measurements. To her, they were an insult. Every morning, I'd find her standing at the edge of her property, arms folded, eyes locked on the markers like they were a personal attack. I learned more about her than I ever wanted to. Long before I bought the lake, she'd positioned herself as the unofficial ruler of the neighborhood. HOA meetings ran long, rules ran longer, and no one challenged her without consequences. Fines appeared. Complaints followed. People learned to stay quiet. Control was her currency, and the lake, open, visible, untamed, had always been her favorite symbol of authority. She hosted gatherings by the water, posed for photos like it was her backyard, and reminded everyone who kept things in order. That's why the sale hit her so hard. I hadn't just bought property. I'd taken something she'd been claiming without ever owning. When I pulled the public records, everything checked out. The boundaries were clear, legal, final. Still, she acted like the truth was a technicality she could pressure into disappearing. The messages started piling up, polite at first, then sharp. She accused me of destroying the character of the neighborhood, of lowering property values, of creating tension where none existed before. I could feel the weight of eyes on me every time I stepped outside, like the whole street was waiting to see how this would end. One evening, I found footprints by the water that weren't mine. Fresh, careful, like someone had stood there for a while, staring out across the lake. It unsettled me more than I expected. This wasn't just about access anymore. It felt personal. I replayed our last conversation in my head. The way her voice dropped when she realized the fence was real. The pause before she smiled again. Slow, deliberate, unsettling. She said nothing threatening. Didn't have to. The silence carried its own message. As the construction date approached, the air around the lake felt heavier. Too quiet, like the calm before something breaks. And standing there alone one night, watching the water darken under the sky, I couldn't shake the feeling that the fence wasn't going to end this. It was only going to push her to do something worse. The first panel of the fence went up just after sunrise. I watched from my porch as the workers unloaded lumber, their movements slow and methodical, like they had no idea they were stepping into someone else's drama. By mid-morning, neighbors had started to gather. Not close enough to intervene, but close enough to stare. Some looked curious. Others looked worried. A few wouldn't meet my eyes at all. That's when the whispers started reaching me. Stories I'd never heard before. About disputes that somehow always ended in her favor. About property lines that shifted just enough to benefit her yard. About people who pushed back and found themselves buried under fines, letters, and endless complaints until they gave up. None of it was provable, just patterns. And patterns can be dangerous when you're on the wrong side of them. I began questioning my own choices. Legally, I was in the clear. Morally, it felt heavier. The fence was my right, but was it worth turning the entire neighborhood against me? I told myself I was protecting my space, my peace. Still, late at night, I wondered if I'd underestimated how far someone like her would go to regain control. She didn't confront me again. That was the strangest part. No shouting. No dramatic scenes. Instead, she watched. From her windows. From her porch. Always quiet. Always smiling that tight smile that never reached her eyes. It felt like the kind of calm that comes after a decision has already been made. Meanwhile, small things started going wrong. A survey marker vanished. One of the fence posts was nudged just enough to look careless. A complaint appeared online about unsafe construction near shared water access. None of it could be traced back to her. But none of it felt accidental either. Then there was the lake. I noticed the water level looked slightly different one morning. Not enough to panic, but enough to notice if you spent every day by it. I told myself it was seasonal. Rain. Drainage. Normal changes. Still, the timing bothered me. One afternoon, an older neighbor finally spoke to me. She lowered her voice, glanced toward the white house by the trees, and said, "Be careful. She doesn't lose." That night, I stood at the edge of the fence, running my hand along the fresh wood. The line between us was solid now, impossible to ignore. And as I looked across at her darkened windows, I realized the real battle hadn't even started yet. It was just changing shape. The morning the fence reached full height, the lake felt different. The air was heavier. Still, no birds, no wind, just the sound of hammers finishing their last strikes, echoing too loudly across the water. When the workers left, the silence was almost painful. I noticed her curtains move. She was watching. Days passed, but the pressure didn't ease. If anything, it tightened. A certified letter arrived, thick with legal language and thinly veiled threats about easements, access rights, and environmental concerns tied to the lake. Every sentence felt carefully chosen, like it had been written by someone who'd done this before. I handed it to my lawyer, but even he paused longer than I liked. Then the call started. Not from her. From the city. From an environmental office asking about runoff. From a zoning clerk double-checking permits that had already been approved. Each call was polite, routine, but stacked together, they formed a pattern I couldn't ignore. Someone was pulling strings. I started documenting everything. Photos, dates, times, every interaction, every change in the water line. Every time I caught her standing just a little too close to the fence, phone in hand, like she was waiting for the right moment. One evening, I found something that made my stomach drop. A survey map, old, folded, tucked halfway under my mailbox like it had been placed there on purpose. The boundary lines on it didn't match the ones I had. The lake looked different, smaller, shifted. I couldn't tell if it was a mistake, a relic, or a warning. When I confronted her, carefully, calmly, she didn't deny anything. She just smiled and said, "Property lines change all the time. You should know that." That night, the lights by the lake flicked on without me touching the switch. Then off again, then on. Reflections jittered across the water, breaking the surface into fragments. I stood there, heart racing, listening to the quiet hum of something unseen. I realized then that this wasn't just about land records or fences anymore. Something was coming, and whatever she was planning, it was already in motion. The twist didn't arrive with noise or confrontation. Came quietly, disguised as help. An envelope appeared on my porch just after dawn. No return address. Inside was a single flash drive and a note with 3 words written in shaky ink. "You're not wrong." I hesitated before plugging it in. When I finally did, my hands went cold. The files weren't rumors or stories, they were records. Emails, old HOA meeting minutes, complaints that had never been submitted but somehow still enforced. Survey requests altered after submission. And buried deeper, a chain of messages between her and a local contractor discussing adjustments to water flow near the lake years before I ever showed up. It reframed everything. The lake hadn't just been a symbol of control. It had been leverage. Quiet, invisible leverage. And I wasn't the first person to get too close to it. As I scrolled, my phone buzzed. A neighbor. Someone who'd avoided me since the fence went up. She didn't waste time. "I heard you're being investigated," she said. Not accusing. Afraid. "She's telling people you're damaging the lake. That the fence is illegal. That you're hiding something." While she was spreading her version of the story, I realized I was standing at a crossroads. I could stay quiet, let lawyers handle it, hope the truth surfaced on its own. Or I could act, expose what I'd just seen and risk turning a Cold War into something public and irreversible. At the same time, the lake dropped again. Noticeably this time. Enough that even passing cars slowed down to look. I stood at the shoreline, staring at the exposed rocks, the change undeniable. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a notice. A formal inspection scheduled. 48 hours. That night, I saw lights moving on her side of the fence. Shadows crossing windows. Doors opening and closing. Somewhere between anger and satisfaction, she was preparing for something. So was I. I backed up the files. Multiple copies. Sent one to my lawyer. Kept one to myself. As I looked out across the dark water, I understood the real twist wasn't the fence, or even the lake. It was this realization. She thought I was alone. And in 2 days, one of us was going to be proven very wrong. The inspection day arrived under a low, gray sky. The kind that makes everything feel exposed. Trucks lined the road. Officials walked the shoreline with clipboards, boots sinking slightly into the damp ground. I stood back, hands in my pockets, heart pounding, replaying every warning, every whisper, every missing marker in my head. She arrived late, sunglasses on, perfect posture, calm smile, too calm. As the inspectors worked, my lawyer handed over documents, permits, surveys, records showing the lake's original boundaries. Then, quietly, he passed them the files from the flash drive. The mood shifted almost instantly. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. One inspector frowned, then asked her a question she clearly hadn't prepared for. About the water adjustments. About the contractor. About why previous complaints were logged but never officially filed. Her smile tightened. She laughed once, lightly, and said it was all a misunderstanding. That people were mistaken. That she was being targeted because she cared too much about the neighborhood. But the calm was slipping now. You could hear it in her voice. See it in the way her hands clenched at her sides. Then came the moment none of us expected. An older man stepped forward, one of the inspectors, I assumed. Instead, he introduced himself as a retired surveyor. He'd worked in the area years ago. He remembered the lake. Remembered being pressured to revise a boundary map. Remembered refusing and being replaced weeks later. The silence that followed was heavy. The investigation didn't end that day, but the story did. Access claims were frozen. Complaints were dismissed. The fence stayed. And for the first time since I moved in, the lake felt like it could breathe again. She didn't look at me as she left. Weeks later, I learned the final twist. The flash drive hadn't come from a random neighbor. It came from someone in her own circle. Someone who'd watched her do this for years and finally decided they couldn't carry it anymore. Control had finally cost her trust. Now, in the mornings, I sit by the water again. The fence stands quiet, no longer a symbol of conflict, just a line where chaos stopped. The lake is calm, honest, unclaimed by anyone who doesn't own it. And every time the sunlight hits the water just right, I'm reminded of the lesson this place taught me. Some people don't melt down when they lose land. They melt down when they lose power. Life around the lake didn't snap back to normal overnight. It eased into it, slowly, like water settling after a stone sinks. The investigations wrapped up quietly. No dramatic announcements. No public apologies. Just a series of letters, corrections, and meetings that suddenly felt very different without her voice dominating the room. The HOA kept going, but it lost its edge. Rules were discussed instead of enforced. Neighbors started talking again. People who once avoided eye contact now waved. A few stopped by to tell me stories they'd never felt safe sharing before. Small moments where they'd felt pushed, cornered, or silenced. Hearing them, I realized the fence hadn't just protected my property. It had forced a boundary everyone else had been too afraid to draw. She moved a few months later. No goodbye, no explanation. Her house sold faster than anyone expected. The lake stayed where it was, unchanged and quiet, as if it had been waiting for the noise to pass. As for me, I learned something uncomfortable about myself. I wasn't as passive as I thought. Standing my ground came with guilt, doubt, and sleepless nights, but also clarity. Owning the lake wasn't about winning. It was about choosing not to surrender peace to someone else's need for control. Sometimes I still walk the length of the fence at dusk. The wood has weathered. The sharpness of the conflict has faded. What remains is the reminder that boundaries matter on land, in neighborhoods, and between people. The lake reflects the sky the same way it always did. But now, when I look at it, I don't see tension or threats. I see resilience. I see the quiet strength it takes to say no when everything around you expects compliance. If there's one thing this experience taught me, it's this: power only works when everyone agrees to give it away. So if you've ever felt pushed aside, silenced, or told to accept something that didn't feel right, remember, you're allowed to draw your own line. Thanks for being here and listening to this story. If it made you think, or reminded you of a moment in your own life, let me know in the comments. And if you want more real stories about neighbors, boundaries, and unexpected consequences, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because sometimes the quietest places hold the loudest lessons.